Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and I'm going to be talking more about long-run growth strategies and more about strategies for looking for sub-Saharan Africa as a whole rather than the specific problems facing South Africa for sub-Saharan Africa to grow over the next quarter century. And the beginning point is the idea that there has been successful development in some parts of the world, in particular East Asia. If we look back 50 years ago, East Asia was not in particularly good shape. Today we take for granted that East Asia was successful. It looked like inevitable, but it certainly was not that there was not that inevitability in the 1960s. So the question is, what happened? What was the miracle that led to the growth of per capita income, which has been stagnant here, to increase 8-10-fold in a relatively short time? Something like that had never happened before. Well, the short answer to their success was they discovered an alternative growth model. And that alternative growth model was manufacturing-led export growth. And that recipe, that idea, is one that many countries in other parts of the world have been thinking about. And it has been, in some sense, the only successful strategy ever in terms of this rapid growth in a short period of time. And so the basic message of my talk is that's not going to work for Africa. That's not going to work for Latin America. It's not going to work for any country going forward. You should not let your exchange rate be determined by Janet Yellen. Or, you know, the fact is, exchange rates are not market-driven phenomena. They are driven by central banks, and central banks are not market institutions. They are government institutions. And the question is, should your government set your exchange rate, or should you let Washington set your exchange rate? In my view, you should set your exchange rate. And that means in particular a low and competitive, and I would say stable exchange rate. And I think you can have a lower exchange rate than you have currently. So that leads to the question is, what is a new framework for, rather than export-led growth, I call it learning-led growth. And it begins by deconstructing export-led growth. And the basic idea here is a simple one, that what was achieved by export-led growth, doing all those things at one time in one sector, can't be done anymore. And therefore, what will have to be done is a multi-pronged, multifaceted strategy, which will have to combine structural transformation and urbanization. It'll have to have some degree of openness, worrying about the foreign exchange constraint, and importantly, about job creation and inequality. So it will have to have aspects where manufacturing will play a role, but it will be more directed, more limited, and where possible taking advantage of natural advantage, like the existence of mineral resources or agriculture. It will also include agriculture, which I think recognized has been emphasized in Africa. In some countries like Nigeria, production of agriculture has actually declined, and that's partly related to exchange rate management. A lot of sub-Saharan Africa has a wealth of mining and oil, which is important for foreign exchange, but typically has not had as much spillovers, but there are ways of changing policy to have more spillovers. And finally, what has to be emphasized, services, it will be the growth sector of the future. And services is a catch-all which includes many different kinds of services, and we'll have to think a lot about what goes within that category. One of the very, a small country, but very country that's been relatively successful is your next door neighbor in Namibia. And they've been successful in mining, but they've also been very successful in service sector, and including in the tourist service sector. And they've been successful in a particular kind of tourism, which is high-end tourism. And the big advantage of high-end tourism is it has less impact on the environment and generates a lot of foreign exchange. And actually has some very, very big impacts on learning. Well, I want to talk a minute about agriculture because it is somewhat controversial about the extent to which agriculture can play a role in the future. But there's a recent report just come out about a month ago from the African Center for Economic Transformation. It's a think tank in Accra, and it argued that for many African countries, agriculture presents the easiest path to industrialization and economic transformation. Increasing productivity and output in a modern agricultural sector would, beyond improving food security and the balance of payments, it would help lead to sustained agro-processing, the manufacturing of agricultural inputs, and a host of services upstream and downstream from farms, creating employment and boosting incomes across the economy. So what it has argued that at the center of of the strategy, and it's emphasized this, that agriculture, if you include all the upstream and downstream linkages with agriculture, can be particularly successful part of the strategy for Africa. So let me conclude. The success and development of the past 60 years was greater than anyone anticipated. There is an enormous gap between the developed and developing countries, not just in resources, which is what the World Bank and was emphasized in development thinking 60 years ago, but really a gap in knowledge. Most of the advanced countries are engaged in the service sector, 80% or more. So if there are disparities in standards of living, it relates to productivity in these service sectors. And there are huge disparities in productivities, not only between countries, but also within countries. And finally, as I say, the basis of success of growth of the past century was export-led growth. The new strategies will have to achieve what that would achieve in a multi-pronged strategy, and will a multi-pronged strategy involving all the major sectors has the prospect of attaining the same success of the old manufacturing export-led strategy if it's structured correctly. But the government will need to play an important role, perhaps even more important role than it played in East Asia, in the new structural transformation. And the future will be based not on a manufacturing economy, but a modern service sector economy. And in Africa's next phase of development, the modern agriculture will also play an important role.